You found your way here, perhaps through quiet curiosity, or in search of something soothing to ease you into rest. Wherever you are, however you feel, you're most welcome here. This is Boring History for Sleep, our little corner of time, where the past unfolds slowly, gently, and always without urgency. Tonight, or perhaps today, depending on the light outside your window, we'll be stepping back into the medieval world, a world filled with flickering candlelight, the low murmur of chapel bells, the rustle of wool skirts across stone floors, and a silence that stretched between seasons. But this world, beautiful in its own ways, held beneath it many quiet tragedies, and among them was the life of the child bride. In this episode, I'll be exploring a subject that is deeply historical and profoundly human, the dark truths behind child marriage in the medieval period, and in particular, the dangers and challenges of pregnancy at such an early age. This won't be a tale of gore or horror. Instead, we'll trace the soft outlines of a harsh reality, always with care, never with sensationalism. Together, we'll walk slowly through the customs and beliefs that shaped these lives, through the halls of forgotten manor houses, the hush of convent walls, and the memories recorded only in passing by monks with ink-stained fingers. So settle in, let your breath slow, let your shoulders ease. There's no need to pay close attention. Let your mind wander when it wants to. And if sleep comes, let it take you. If you're new here, you're warmly invited to subscribe to our quiet corner of YouTube. And if you'd like, leave us a soft little comment below. Let us know where and when you're watching from. Perhaps you're listening late at night, or drifting off with the morning light. Now, let's begin, with a life that was expected to be over before it ever truly began. Imagine a small village, its roofs thatched and its walls wattle and daub, nestled in the bend of a slow-moving river. The morning mist clings to the heather and the clods have turned earth, and inside a cottage, a girl stirs before dawn. Her fingers are stiff from cold. Her hands already bear the roughness of labor. She is 8, perhaps 9 years old. In our world, she would be a child still wrapped in wonder, a child with crayons or storybooks. But in hers, she is already being watched. Not for mischief or misbehavior, but for ripening, for signs that her body is beginning to change, that she might soon be ready to be given away. In the medieval world, childhood was a fleeting concept. The language of the time didn't separate it cleanly from adulthood. Instead, there were phases: infancy, youth, maidenhood, and then womanhood, often defined more by biological signs than by age. Girls were girls until they could bear children. After that, they were women, whether they were ready or not. Daily life for children in this world was marked by work and imitation. The rhythms of their days were woven tightly into the routines of their parents: fetching water, grinding grain, tending animals. A daughter might learn the arts of weaving, of mending, of baking, and most importantly, of obedience. Obedience was the thread that stitched together the expectations of medieval femininity. It's difficult for us now to place ourselves in such a world, but if you close your eyes, you might picture her. A girl standing in a smoky kitchen, hands folded neatly in front of her apron, watching her mother press loaves into the warm belly of a clay oven. She listens to conversations about harvests, about neighbors, about marriage arrangements. She understands little, but she knows this. One day, those talks will be about her. And in many cases, they already are. The idea of a child bride in the medieval context is not merely a cruel aberration. It was embedded in the structure of society. Marriage was less about romance and more about lineage, land, and loyalty. Children were born into obligations, not freedoms. And so, for noble families, for merchants, even for villagers with a cow and a dream, daughters were not just daughters. They were alliances waiting to be forged. The age of betrothal could be shockingly young by modern standards, as early as 5 or 6. The legal age for marriage varied depending on location, but church law generally allowed for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These were not arbitrary numbers, but drawn from interpretations of biblical and Roman precedent. Ideas about physical maturity, about knowing right from wrong, and about divine will. And while consummation was sometimes delayed, it wasn't always. The girl's body might still be small, but once she began menstruating, her utility as a bride and a mother became real. She might not yet know how to manage a household, or how to read a psalm, or how to calm an infant's cry, but she would be sent anyway, to another village, another house, another bed. There, childhood would slip from her shoulders like a nightdress she had outgrown. But even before that point, even before she became a bride, her life was shaped by what was expected of her. Her future was a known path, drawn not in dreams, but in duty. Imagine her again, kneeling at the edge of a hearth, the red light of the fire dancing across her cheek. Her face is soft, her eyes curious, but she knows better than to speak out of turn. She is learning to be silent, to listen, to wait. And somewhere, not far from that village, a man twice her age, perhaps more, is already speaking her name, negotiating, positioning, calculating, preparing to receive her as a wife. Such was the rhythm of their lives, a rhythm shaped by the church, by custom, and by generations of repetition. It was not questioned, it was lived. And while there may have been laughter in her days, joy in festivals, warmth in her mother's touch, always there was the quiet press of what was coming, like the weight of a heavy blanket on a cold night, comforting in its familiarity, but hard to breathe beneath. If you picture a medieval church, you might see crumbling stone softened by ivy, its doors open to a quiet interior thick with the scent of wax and age, wooden pews worn smooth by generations of kneeling, light filtered through narrow windows, casting long strips of color across a dirt floor. A stillness pervades, broken only by the low creak of timbers and the distant call of crows. In that space, cool, sacred, and calm, the most significant transitions of life were marked: baptisms, confessions, marriages, and burials. And among them, the binding of husband and wife stood as a moment not of personal desire, but of spiritual importance. Marriage in the medieval world was not merely a social arrangement. It was understood as a sacrament, a holy covenant overseen by the church, blessed by God, and enforced by canon law. And in this system, a young girl's future was not just a family matter. It was a matter of faith. The church's teachings, drawn from scripture and Roman custom, taught that marriage served 3 purposes: the procreation of children, the avoidance of sin, and the mutual support of the couple. Love, as we think of it today, was not necessary. Consent, however, was, at least in theory. But what did consent look like for a child? Canon law required that both parties agree to the union, a principle that, on parchment, seemed progressive. Girls under 12 could be betrothed, but their consent would not be binding until they reached the age of reason, usually marked at 12. And yet, in practice, the voices of girls were rarely their own. Family honor, land disputes, inheritance, political allegiances, these spoke more loudly than the murmurings of a child bride. And so it was that priests often found themselves standing before young couples, their hands joined, repeating vows in Latin the children scarcely understood. The ceremony might be simple: a blessing outside the church doors, a few drops of holy water, a kiss of peace. Sometimes it took place in haste, barely witnessed, under pressure of scandal or strategy. Other times it was a grand affair, even for a girl barely into her 2nd decade of life. The church walked a careful path. It warned against too young unions, advised waiting until maturity, and sometimes chastised fathers who pushed daughters into early marriages. But its rules also gave flexibility. Exceptions were made, loopholes permitted, and always there was the greater good of preserving chastity, ensuring legitimacy, maintaining order. Imagine now the little bride standing at the threshold of the chapel. Her gown may have been borrowed. Her hands may have trembled. She may have carried a garland of dried flowers, rosemary for remembrance, perhaps, or rue for sorrow. A priest with a weathered face reads from a book bound in leather, its pages dotted with strange symbols. She does not understand the Latin. She barely knows the man at her side. And yet, in the eyes of her family, her village, and her God, she is now a wife. From this moment forward, her role is changed. She is expected to serve her husband, to bear his children, to manage his home. She may still be too small to lift a sack of grain or carry a bucket of water, but she will be expected to nurture a child, perhaps within the year. The church taught that the marital bed was sacred, but it also insisted that a woman must not deny her husband. The idea of conjugal debt, the mutual obligation of spouses to one another, meant that even the youngest wife could not refuse what was expected of her. And if she did, she might be corrected, advised, or simply ignored. Yet despite this, there were moments of kindness. There were priests who hesitated, who counseled delay, monasteries that provided refuge, convents that accepted girls into sisterhoods rather than seeing them sold, and sometimes, though rarely, families who chose differently, allowing daughters to grow before binding them. But the overwhelming tide of custom was difficult to resist. Marriage was sacred. It was duty. And for many, it was the only path forward. As you lie there, perhaps beneath your own soft covers, listening to the hum of modern life, the buzz of a distant appliance, the sigh of passing cars, it can be difficult to grasp the sheer weight that religious law carried in the past. It shaped every aspect of daily life, from when one could eat meat to whom one could touch. It blessed harvests and bound kings, and it whispered into the ears of children as they were led to the altar. Let us now wander from the chapel to the hearthside, from the echoing solemnity of stone walls to the quieter confines of family homes and candlelit rooms. In these more intimate spaces, another kind of ritual was taking place, one rooted not in scripture, but in silver, wool, and quiet bargaining. Here, the future of a girl was being calculated in coin and cloth. Her value whispered across tables where she was often not allowed to sit. Dowries, they were not merely traditions. They were transactions. In the medieval world, a dowry served as both a gift and a guarantee. It was a father's offering to secure his daughter's place in another household, and at the same time, a safety net, in case she were to be widowed or sent away. A dowry might include land, livestock, linens, gold rings, or bolts of dyed wool. It might be recorded in a marriage contract, a parchment scrawled in Latin or the vernacular, tucked away in a coffer, its seal barely dry. It was, in every way, a binding commitment, a girl's worth, quantified. Imagine a small room warmed by a low fire, the scent of tallow and damp wood lingering in the air. A man sits at a table with a parish clerk, discussing his daughter. She is not there. She is outside, perhaps feeding chickens or sweeping the stoop. Inside, her future is being measured. 2 pigs, a loom, and half a parcel of barley field. Perhaps a ring with a blue stone. Perhaps a pair of gloves. Enough, it is hoped, to make her appealing. Not too much to leave the family poor. Among the nobility, the numbers were higher, the stakes greater. A baron might pledge a small estate or several manors in exchange for the right connection. Royal families treated daughters as tools of diplomacy, inked onto maps before they learned to read. Princesses were sent across seas with trunks of treasure and strangers waiting at docks. But among peasants and townsfolk, The calculations were just as complex, just as heavy. A dowry might be scraped together over years, mothers sewing extra linens, fathers bargaining over cattle. For many, the ability to provide a dowry determined whether a girl would marry at all. Without it, her chances were slim. With it, a new life could begin, far from the village she'd known. But the dowry was only one side of the bargain. The groom's family might offer a bride price or a mourning gift, a token given the day after the wedding, meant to honor the wife's new station. It was a world of expectations balanced carefully on the shoulders of very young girls. There were contracts, sometimes verbal, sometimes formal. Witnesses were called. Hands were shaken. Occasionally, a token was passed, a knife, a cup, a handful of soil, to seal the pact. The language of these arrangements was dry, impersonal, transactional. They spoke of land, not love, of exchange, not affection. And in the midst of this, the bride-to-be continued her chores. She might not know the full extent of what had been agreed. She might not even meet her future husband until days before the wedding. And if the agreement fell through, if the dowry proved too small, or a better offer came along, she might be quietly forgotten, replaced in the negotiations like one coin for another. It's easy to imagine this as cold and cruel, but for many, it was simply the way things were. A father who secured a good match for his daughter believed he was giving her a future. A girl sent to a richer household might gain status, security, even eventual comfort. She might rise above her station. She might become the mistress of a kitchen, the mother of many. She might live a longer life than the one the village promised. But always there was the risk that she would not live long at all. For the economic logic that brought her into marriage did not extend to the risks she would bear within it. The silver rings on her fingers did not protect her from the dangers of childbirth. The sheep counted in her dowry did not ease her labor pains. These were costs not calculated in any contract. These were paid quietly with her body. And so the bargain, once sealed, became something more than a transaction. It became a fate. Let us linger here a little longer, in this place between childhood and matrimony, where economics and emotion blur. Picture the girl in her small room, running her fingers across a folded shift of linen given as part of her dowry. She doesn't know yet how to feel. She has been told this is a good thing. She has been told she is lucky. She has seen older girls go before her and younger ones following behind. And still, she cannot help but wonder who will hold her hand when she leaves. In the next part, we'll turn to the rituals themselves, the ceremony and betrothal, the gestures and symbols that marked this passage from girlhood to womanhood, and how, beneath the songs and smiles, there was often a quiet sense of ending, the end of play, the end of freedom, the beginning of something altogether more solemn. Let's drift onward now to the threshold of marriage itself. The passage into marriage was not, for most medieval girls, a sudden leap, but a slow and quiet erosion of youth, like a shoreline gently worn by a tide that did not ask for permission. From the first whispered discussions among parents to the moment when her hand was formally placed in another's, the child slowly faded, replaced by someone expected to serve, to bear, to endure. Betrothal, or sponsalia, was the formal promise of marriage. In many places and times, it was a distinct event, not a mere agreement, but a ceremony all its own. In the lower stone churches of England, in the sun-washed villages of southern France, and in the colder timber-bird halls of the German states, this moment was marked with quiet dignity and enduring custom. The couple, sometimes both children, sometimes with a yawning difference in age, would stand before family and perhaps before the village priest. There might be a kiss, a ring, simple and of pewter or brass, a solemn promise in the vernacular tongue. "I plight thee my troth," the boy might say. "And I thee," the girl would reply, her voice soft, not from shyness, but from the weight of the moment. This promise, this betrothal, was often enough to bind them legally. From that day on, the girl was known as a bride. Her tasks changed. Her behavior was watched more closely. Her body became a thing not quite her own, prepared for the role it was destined to perform. Chastity was not only expected, it was monitored. Neighbors noticed if she lingered in doorways or wandered alone. Her laughter was measured. Her gaze, too. There were celebrations, but they were muted affairs, at least compared to the richer feasts of full marriage. Bread and ale were shared. Elders spoke soft blessings. Occasionally, music played on a single pipe or fiddle, but behind the smiles, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of finality. The child had begun to vanish. If the families were noble or wealthy, the rituals became more elaborate. In some households, the girl would be dressed in colors chosen for fertility, saffron or green, and veiled modestly as a symbol of her transition. She might be given a girdle embroidered with charms or a circlet of pressed herbs to wear around her neck. A dowry chest would be opened and its contents examined, not just by the groom's family, but by neighbors and kin. The future bride's readiness was no secret. It was displayed. But in quieter villages, where such symbols were beyond reach, the transformation was still marked. The mother might comb her daughter's hair differently. An older cousin might whisper advice that was passed down like old recipes. Keep your hands busy. Don't speak unless spoken to. Pray before sleep. A candle might be lit in the church, or a coin pressed into the girl's hand by her father, meant to remind her of the cost and value of what she was about to become. The time between betrothal and marriage varied. Sometimes it was months, sometimes years, and sometimes it was almost no time at all. If the girl had reached puberty, if the signs of womanhood had begun to show, the marriage could proceed swiftly. There might be urgency to secure inheritance, to legitimize an heir, or simply to avoid scandal. And in those cases, the girl might find herself transformed overnight. Imagine now a small room on the morning of a wedding. The rushes on the floor freshly scattered. The window just a slit of light. The bride's hands are being washed by her mother, not because they are dirty, but because that is the custom. A final gesture of care. Her hair is brushed and braided. A borrowed necklace, cold against her throat. She is told to smile. She does. There are bells ringing, or perhaps just the low knock of a visitor come to lead her outside. In some traditions, she would be walked to the church by family, flanked by girls her age who would soon follow in her steps. Her face might be veiled, or not. Sometimes she would carry a small sprig of rosemary or myrtle, sometimes nothing at all. The important thing was that she walked forward, that she entered into the covenant quiet and composed. The wedding rite itself was like all things ecclesiastical, a mixture of formality and mystery. Latin words spoken by a priest, blessings called down, rings exchanged if they could be afforded, a kiss of peace, a promise, and then the procession to the husband's house. The door opened to her as a symbol that her place had changed. And yet, for all this ritual, all this ceremony, the girl was still a child. She may have laughed at games just a few weeks before. She may have braided flowers into her hair in springtime, or sung to herself while turning the butter churn. But now, she was cloaked in responsibility, in expectation, in the slow, silent fear of the unknown. And this, perhaps, is the most haunting truth of all, that her transformation was not one of will or readiness, but of ritual. Her world said she was ready, and so she had to be. Some girls were kindled with hope. Some were frightened. Some simply endured. But all were caught in a current far older than themselves. A tradition shaped by time and law and belief, moving them forward into roles that had no exit, only endurance. And so, the child vanished. Not in a single moment, but in 100 small ones. in the folding of linens, in the tightening of a bodice, in the recitation of unfamiliar vows. She may have smiled that day. She may have looked up at her new husband with a kind of wonder, or perhaps with nothing at all. And when she lay down that night in a strange room, on unfamiliar sheets, with her hands folded above her chest like a child in prayer, she may have whispered to herself, not a question, but a remembering. The human body is a remarkable thing, flexible, adaptable, quietly strong. But it is also fragile, particularly when it has not yet finished growing. In the medieval world, this fragility was often ignored in the face of tradition, necessity, and belief. Girls were expected to become women through the act of bearing children, sometimes long before their bodies were prepared to do so. In this segment, we turn inward to the quiet workings of the body, the slow rhythms of blood and bone, and to the heavy cost of placing a life within someone who had scarcely begun her own, the age of 12. It marked, for many, the threshold of womanhood, not because of maturity or readiness, but because of menstruation. The appearance of a girl's first period was often met not with sympathy or curiosity, but with expectation. It was a signal, a biological bell tolling quietly in the dark, telling the world she could now be wed and pregnant. But while menstruation might begin around that age, the body itself was still years away from completing its growth. The pelvis, that crucial cradle of childbirth, would not be fully developed, the spine still lengthening, the muscles still soft, unformed. The womb may have awakened, but the rest of the body had not yet caught up. And yet, many girls were made pregnant. Pregnancy in a fully grown woman places great demands on the body. Increased blood volume, strain on the heart, shifting joints, swelling tissues. In a girl of 13, those effects were amplified. Her own bones might be stealing calcium from the fetus, her heart racing to supply both herself and the growing child. Fatigue that never lifted, breathlessness with every movement, and pain, not the sharp kind we associate with injury, but the slow, aching discomfort of being pulled into a shape not yet meant to hold so much. There were no prenatal vitamins in the medieval world, no ultrasound machines or blood pressure cuffs. A pregnant child might not even know she was expecting until the signs became unmistakable. The tightening of her bodice, the swelling of her ankles, the strange flutter beneath her ribs. And once the pregnancy was visible, there was no turning back. Midwives, if they were available, might provide gentle herbs or whispered advice. But often, especially in the countryside, young brides simply endured alone. Their mothers might have borne children at the same age. The community saw it as natural. And yet, it was not. The risks of pregnancy in adolescence are well known even today. Infections, preeclampsia, obstructed labor. But in the medieval period, these risks were accepted as part of life, or rather, as part of death. Many did not survive, and those who did were forever changed. Imagine the small figure of a girl, only slightly taller than a child, sitting on the edge of a straw mattress. Her feet do not touch the floor. Her hands rest on the swell of her belly, too large for her frame. She breathes slowly, uncertainly. She is not yet sure what is happening. She has heard stories, from older women, from her husband, from the midwife, who smells of lavender and smoke. But stories do not prepare one for the physicality of it. The baby inside her stirs. Her ribs ache. She has not slept well in weeks. And outside, in the village square, no one remarks. This is expected. This is normal. This is what she is for. Yet her body is still building itself. Her bones are soft. Her hips narrow. The very act of carrying a child may shift her spine permanently, distort her posture, leave her with pain she will carry all her life. And the act of giving birth, well, we will come to that in time. It is important to understand that most medieval people did not view this as cruelty. They saw it as the rhythm of the world. Girls grew up. Girls married. Girls gave birth. Some lived. Some did not. The same was true of their babies. It was not questioned. It was woven into the fabric of life, like the tolling of bells at vespers or the changing of seasons. But for the girl, the experience was deeply personal. There was little space for reflection, no letters written, no diaries kept. Her suffering, if it was recorded at all, appeared as a line in a church register or a scribbled note in a ledger. Wife of Thomas, died in childbed, or simply stillborn. She may have wept. She may have been silent. She may have wondered, in the quiet hours of the night, if this was all her life would ever be. And sometimes, tragically, that was true. Still, in rare moments, there was help. A kind grandmother, a kind-eyed midwife, a husband who waited, who watched. There were herbs brewed into teas, raspberry leaf, motherwort. There were prayers said over swollen bellies. There was hope, even in uncertainty. But the weight was always there. Not only the physical burden of the unborn child, but the invisible pressure of expectation, of tradition, of duty. It pressed on her as surely as any swaddling band or tightening corset, and she bore it silently. Perhaps she lay by a hearth, watching the smoke twist upwards. Perhaps she counted the days by the rhythm of the bells. Perhaps she imagined the child within her as a flower, small and stubborn, growing in rocky soil. And perhaps she did not imagine at all. Now let us shift our gaze from the body to the record, from the ache of a young girl's womb to the crisp ink of parchment and vellum. Here, in the quiet stacks of monastic archives and in the margins of legal ledgers, lies the shadowy outline of an undeniable truth. Girls as young as 12, and sometimes younger, carried pregnancies in the medieval world. Their stories are scattered and brief, rarely centered, often written as afterthoughts. But still, they remain. In royal and noble circles, these instances were more likely to be documented, not because they were unusual, but because these girls mattered to dynasties. Their fertility was of interest. Their offspring, potential heirs. Their wombs were watched with care, not compassion. And so the evidence lingers in genealogies and household accounts. Take, for example, Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. She was married at 12, gave birth at 13. Her labor was long, difficult, and nearly killed her. She survived, but her body was so badly affected that she never bore another child. Her son, the future King of England, was both her triumph and her ending. Her early labor became a footnote in royal history, not for its suffering, but for its consequence. Then there is Joan of France, wed before her 12th birthday. Her marriage was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, that is, being too closely related, but only after political tides had shifted. Had they not, she too might have become pregnant within months. The concern wasn't her body, but the legitimacy of the union. In peasant records, the trail is fainter. Parish registers were not always precise with ages. A girl of 12 might be listed as of age if she had reached menstruation. We know, from surviving coroner's rolls and manor court entries, that deaths in childbirth occurred among young wives. Sometimes they are noted with pity, more often with indifference. Alice, daughter of John the Carter, wife of Richard, died in her lying in, the babe also lost. A girl of 14, married with her child. Wife of Allen, no more than 13 winters, passed in the night. These quiet lines, penned by monks or clerks, do not pause for mourning. They move on, from death to debt, from childbed to cattle dispute. But for those willing to read slowly, carefully, the truth becomes clear. Many young girls died in the earliest chapters of womanhood. And yet, there were also births recorded, names of children born to young mothers, who then passed from the page into silence. We know little of what became of these children, whether they thrived whether they too lived short lives. But their existence suggests that not all child pregnancies ended in loss. Some survived, some endured. Medical treatises of the time rarely discouraged early pregnancy. The body was seen through the lens of Galenic theory, balances of humors, and divine design. A menstruating girl was capable, in the eyes of many, of bearing children. The risks were acknowledged but accepted, much like the perils of plague or famine. And still, there were voices, small, uncertain, that questioned the wisdom of it. Some midwives, though rarely recorded by name, cautioned against pregnancies in young girls. They spoke of narrow hips and soft bones, of weak constitutions. In private conversations, passed through generations, they may have shared stories of loss, of two young mothers who bled too long, who labored for days, who slipped away in silence. But these warnings rarely reached the ears of those in power. For a landowner, a merchant, a noble lord, a fertile young wife was an asset, and the sooner she bore fruit, the better. What mattered most was lineage, succession, alliance, not her safety. And so the ledgers filled slowly with names. Names of girls who became wives, wives who became mothers, mothers who became memories. Their ages rarely listed, their stories rarely told. It is difficult to read these records without a modern sense of sorrow. But we must remember, for them, this was the rhythm of life. Expected, endured, accepted. Still, there are moments of resistance. In court rolls, we sometimes see girls fleeing arranged marriages. A case in 1382 speaks of a girl of 13 who ran away from her betrothed. She was found by a relative, returned, and wed. But in that brief flight, we glimpse something else, the flicker of will. And in the letters of a merchant's wife, we find mention of a young girl, unnamed, who was taken in after the death of her husband in childbirth. She is small, the letter reads, and her eyes are empty. A sentence brief as a breath, but full of quiet pain. As we lay these records gently before us, we do not seek to judge the people of the past. We seek only to see them clearly, patiently, to understand the conditions under which they lived and the choices they never had the chance to make. Not every pregnancy ended in birth, and not every birth ended in joy. In the medieval world, the line between life and death was often thin. A soft breath, a still silence, a heartbeat missed. When it came to young brides, pregnant far too soon, this line was often crossed quietly, without witness or record. Miscarriage, stillbirth, loss that came not with loud mourning, but with silence. To be pregnant at 12 or 13, as many were, was to carry a child in a body still learning itself. The chances of complications were many. Malnutrition, infection, overwork, and the sheer narrowness of a child's pelvis could all interrupt the process of gestation. And so, many pregnancies ended early, sometimes at 2 months, sometimes at 6, sometimes in full term, but with no breath to follow. Yet unlike today, these losses were not always named. The language of grief was different. There were no widely accepted rituals for miscarriages. Stillbirths were not always seen as full deaths, particularly if the child had not been baptized. The Church, steeped in its theology, held that a soul could not enter heaven if it had not received the sacrament of baptism. And so, if a baby died in the womb, or was born lifeless, it often went unnamed, unblessed, unburied in sacred ground. It was an additional cruelty, layered quietly atop an already unbearable pain. Imagine a young girl, no older than 13, lying on a bed of straw, her skirts soaked, her face pale with fever. Around her, the room is still. A midwife stirs a pot over the fire. A mother sits with hands clasped. The birth is over, but the baby, small, limp, silent, lies wrapped in linen beside her. A candle flickers, casting long shadows on the walls. There is no cry. There is no movement. In some cases, the body of the child would be buried quietly in an unmarked place, behind the cottage, perhaps, or at the edge of the field. If a priest was present, he might offer a prayer, a whispered Latin blessing. But often, there was no priest, no ceremony, just earth and silence. The girl might ask what had happened, or she might not. She might be told the baby was too small, too weak, too early, or she might simply be left to wonder. The pain of miscarriage, both physical and emotional, was rarely spoken of openly. To bleed unexpectedly, to lose the quickening that had begun within, was something often born in solitude. It could happen suddenly, while drawing water, or scrubbing stone, or bending to gather wood. A cramp, a rush of blood, a dizzying moment of absence. And then it was over. Sometimes it was blamed on sin, sometimes on evil spirits, or fright, or bad air. A woman might be told she had lifted something too heavy, or that she had eaten the wrong herb, or that God, in his wisdom, had taken what was never meant to be. Among midwives and older women, however, there was knowledge, quiet wisdom passed down through gestures and glances. A warm cloth, a tincture of mugwort, the right words to say, the right ones to avoid, not because they could prevent the loss. They could not, but because they understood its weight, and they understood the silence that followed. Stillbirth, too, was not uncommon. A full pregnancy might end in a long and painful labor, only to yield a baby who never breathed. Sometimes the body was malformed. Sometimes the cord had twisted. Sometimes there was no reason at all, just absence where there should have been sound. For child brides, the physical toll was even greater. Their bodies, undernourished, unready, struggled not only to carry, but to deliver. Obstructed labor was one of the most common causes of death among young mothers. And when the baby died before the mother, it added to the trauma, a wound within a wound. Yet the community, hardened by constant loss, did not always pause. Life continued. Fields needed tilling. Bread needed baking. The girl, if she survived, was expected to rise, to return to work, to try again. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she could not. The church offered little comfort. Without baptism, the child was not permitted burial in consecrated ground. Some parishes allowed for special prayers, liminal rites set at the boundary of tradition. But more often, the dead infant was quietly buried in unconsecrated earth, a hedgerow, a field's edge, a place where no bell would toll. And for the mother, there was no formal mourning, no period of rest. Her loss was not commemorated in song or in sermon. Her pain was her own. Even among nobles, this was often true. Letters from the 14th and 15th centuries contain brief mentions. The child was lost. The babe did not live. A daughter, still and cold. The phrasing is clinical, detached. It does not capture the reality, the weight of a small body held once and never again. And yet, we can imagine it. We must. We can imagine the girl lying awake at night, her arms empty, her belly sore, her mind silent. She may not have known how to name what she felt, but she felt it all the same. Perhaps she whispered a name to the dark. Perhaps she never spoke of it again. Let us now step with reverence into the final chamber of this segment, a quiet and unadorned room where many stories ended before they could truly begin. The death of a mother in childbirth, maternal mortality, was tragically common in the medieval world. It was a risk every woman bore, no matter her station. But for child brides, still so young, the danger was far greater. Their bodies, narrow, incomplete, unready, were asked to do something they could not yet do, and often they died trying. The term childbed fever, or puerperal fever, was not known by its clinical name in those days, but its symptoms were familiar. A day or two after birth, the mother might begin to sweat, to shiver, to burn with fever. Her belly would swell painfully. Her breathing would grow short, and within days, sometimes hours, she would slip into delirium, then stillness. These deaths were often attributed to corruption of the humors, or bad air, or divine will. But we know now they were frequently caused by infection, bacteria introduced during birth by unwashed hands, dirty tools, or contaminated linens. And in a time before germ theory, there was no way to stop it. But even before infection, there were other dangers. The bones of a 12 or 13-year-old girl had often not yet widened enough to allow for safe delivery. Obstructed labor was the name we now give to this, a labor in which the baby cannot pass through the birth canal. Hours turned to days. The pain became unbearable. The body began to give out. Midwives could sometimes intervene with prayer, massage, herbal tinctures, or the crude instruments of the time, but their success was limited. More often, nothing could be done. The girl would grow weak. Her pulse would fade. Her breath would slow. And then, surrounded by whispered prayers and the scent of wax and blood, she would be gone. The child might live, or it might not. Either way, the story of the mother ended there. And her name? Often, it was recorded in the church register. Anna, wife of Robert, died in childbed. Sometimes, not even that, just a notation. A line between births and burials. No age listed, no sorrow expressed. Among the nobility, these deaths could ripple through dynasties. A duchess lost in childbirth might delay succession, trigger political upheaval, or prompt a hasty remarriage. But even then, the woman's role was understood as functional. Her death was tragic, but expected. In one record from the late 13th century, a girl of 13 is described as having expired in her first travail. The phrasing is clinical, almost gentle. Expired, like a candle. But consider what that candle meant. A life extinguished before it had found its shape. A girl who had never finished growing, asked to create life before she had lived her own. Imagine now the dim interior of a cottage. The fire has gone cold. The midwife has left. The child lies in a cradle. The young mother lies beside it, covered to the chin in a warm woolen sheet. The room is silent, save for the rustle of wind against the shutter. Outside, the village continues. Someone chops wood. A dog barks in the distance. A bell rings. Inside, time stands still. Her parents might grieve. Her husband may sit motionless. Or perhaps he has already turned his thoughts to a new wife, for the fields still need tilling. The hearth still needs tending. Life, for those who remain, moves forward. But for her, it stops. Maternal mortality was, for centuries, the leading cause of death among young women. It was so common that it shaped language, custom, and ritual. In some places, women in labor were given the rights of the dying before delivery, just in case. Midwives whispered prayers as they worked. Candles were lit for safe passage. But when the mother was only a girl, the tragedy was all the more quiet, less noticed, less remarked upon. After all, what had she become before she vanished? A name in a ledger, a line in a contract, a whisper on her wedding day. She had not had time to become known, and yet she mattered. Her pain mattered. Her absence mattered. We remember her now not because she left behind chronicles or castles, but because she was one among many, too many. A soft voice swallowed by the expectations of her time. A life given to tradition. And though she left no portrait, no poem, no tombstone with dates, we can still see her, in our minds at least. A girl with braided hair. A voice that might have sung. A heart that might have loved, if given time. And now, we let her rest. So far, we have walked through fields of quiet sorrow, through the lives of girls too young to carry what they were asked to bear. And now, as we step onward, we shift our attention, gently, with care, to the women who stood beside them. Women not always remembered by name, but whose presence was essential. The guardians of labor, the quiet stewards of life, the midwives. In a time when medicine was still cloaked in mysticism and guesswork, midwives occupied a unique place. They were not doctors, for doctors were few, and when they did exist, they were expensive, male, and often afraid of childbirth itself. Midwives, on the other hand, were women of the community, women who had seen life begin again and again, sometimes hundreds of times. They did not wear robes or carry surgical tools. Their instruments were simpler: strong hands, steady eyes, a length of linen, a sharp knife for the cord, and a basin for warm water, perhaps a charm stitched into their apron, a prayer on their lips. Imagine a woman in her middle years, face lined with experience, eyes softened by sleep, lost to many a midnight knock on the door. She arrives at a small home just as the girl begins her labor. She knows the signs, the way the girl clutches her side, the sweat beading at her brow, the stillness between contractions, and the fear, always, that something might go wrong. She speaks softly. She prepares the bedding. She washes her hands in water, scented faintly with rosemary, or, if it can be found, lavender. She may carry herbs, not because they work miracles, but because they bring some comfort. Pennyroyal, motherwort, meadowsweet. She has seen young girls give birth before. Too many. She knows the signs of danger. When the blood doesn't stop, when the child won't turn, when the breath grows shallow. She does what she can. She whispers the old words, the ones passed down from her mother and her mother before her. Words with no power in books, but great weight in memory. And when it is over, if both mother and child live, she gives thanks. If not, she bows her head. Midwives were not always trusted by the church. Their knowledge, passed down orally, unregulated by formal learning, was viewed with suspicion. Some were accused of witchcraft, not because they did harm, but because they wielded wisdom outside of clerical control. They knew things no priest did: the texture of afterbirth, the chill that crept into a mother's skin when life began to leave her. But despite this suspicion, midwives were indispensable. They were called day and night, paid in coin when available, or in bread, or cheese, or a bolt of cloth. They did not ask questions. They did not turn anyone away. A girl of 12, shaking with fear and pain, was as much a mother in their eyes as any duchess. Alongside the midwife, there might also be a matron, an older woman of the household, or the girl's own mother. These women did not deliver the child, but they comforted. They wiped foreheads. They spoke softly. They held hands when pain became too much. They reminded the girl to breathe. In noble households, this group might be larger, several attendants. A physician called in haste if the birth went poorly. But even then, it was the midwife who remained at the center, the one who did not flinch, the one who stayed when others stepped away. These women bore much, not only the weight of lives being born, but also the sorrow of those lost. They carried the memories of every birth they had attended, the good and the bad, the girls who screamed, the ones who stayed silent, the babies born blue, the mothers who never opened their eyes again. And they did it again and again and again. There are very few records of their names. Sometimes they appear in court cases, when blamed for a death or praised for a miraculous survival. Occasionally, a bishop would issue a license to a trusted midwife, granting her permission to perform emergency baptisms if a child was dying. These moments are rare, but they reveal the immense trust placed in these women, even when official recognition was withheld. They were both feared and revered. They walked a line between the natural and the sacred. They knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. A girl giving birth for the first time might remember only the midwife's touch, the firmness of her voice, the warmth of her cloth, the steadiness of her hands. In a world that gave her few choices, the midwife offered something rare: presence. Sometimes the midwife was the last person the girl saw, and sometimes, only sometimes, she was the one who made the difference. Let us pause here and honor those hands that held so many, that caught first breaths, that comforted final ones, that cleaned and soothed and held space for sorrow. In a world without hospitals, without sterile gloves or electric monitors, the care given to a pregnant girl rested in the hands of women and the weight of tradition. That care was neither scientific nor uniform, but a blend of folk knowledge, herbs, whispered prayers, and humble rituals. These were the tools of survival or comfort when survival was not possible. There were no checkups or diagnostic charts. Instead, care was felt and watched. A woman's gait, the color of her lips, the strength of her appetite, the rhythm of her breath. Midwives, matrons, and herbal women, each in her own way, learned to read these signs, though they were rarely written down. Imagine the quiet interior of a cottage, its beams blackened by years of smoke. A table scattered with dried sprigs of herbs, some tied in bundles, others crushed into powders. On a shelf rests a small pot, dark with age, used only for brewing childbirth teas. The scent in the air is earthy, slightly sweet, a blend of chamomile, lavender, perhaps yarrow. The fire pops and crackles in the hearth, and above it, a woman moves with practiced calm. This is the kind of place where medieval prenatal care took shape. Let us begin with the herbs. Raspberry leaf, though not understood in modern clinical terms, was used to tone the womb and ease labor. Motherwort, as the name suggests, was given to soothe anxiety and regulate the heartbeat. Mugwort, sacred in some places, was burned or steeped to relieve cramps and open the womb. Some herbs were calming. Some were believed to stimulate blood flow or bring on labor. Their use was cautious, passed down through generations, their doses measured not in milligrams, but in pinches and intuition. But not all remedies were botanical. There were charms, small objects believed to protect the mother and unborn child. A bit of stag bone, worn on a cord around the neck. A wax medallion, stamped with the figure of the Virgin Mary. A pouch containing 3 herbs, 1 feather, and a sliver of iron, sewn into a girl's shift and kept hidden until after the birth. These were not considered superstitions, but sacred protections. Religious belief intertwined with care in seamless ways. Women might visit shrines before delivery. One popular destination was the Shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham, where women prayed for safe birth, leaving offerings of cloth or ribbon. Holy water might be sprinkled across the threshold of the birthing room. A psalm spoken aloud, often Psalm 121, whose verses were believed to guard against death in labor. Inside the home, symbols were prepared. A candle blessed at Candlemas, if it had been saved, would be lit during delivery. A piece of bread marked with a cross might be placed beneath the mattress. Some women wore birthing girdles, long ribbons of parchment inscribed with prayers and saints' names, wrapped around the belly in the final weeks. These practices were not idle fancy. They were expressions of hope, of care, of quiet desperation in the face of unknown outcomes. And yet, for all these protections, the body still bore the brunt of the process. Girls who were too young, too small, were particularly vulnerable. Their caretakers knew this, even if the church, even if the law, chose not to speak of it. And so, extra care might be taken. More prayers whispered, stronger teas brewed, extra charms sewn beneath the pillow. In some places, astrology played a role. Certain phases of the moon were seen as dangerous. A midwife might consult the stars before accepting a delivery, or urge the mother to wait, though labor, as now, rarely respected timetables. Still, belief had its power. When the time for birth came, the midwife took charge. The room was warmed. The windows shuttered. Only women allowed. The girl, pale, frightened, was helped into position, often seated upright, on a special stool if available, or propped with pillows and straw. Words were spoken, sometimes soft songs, sometimes scripture, sometimes nothing at all. And if the birth was long or hard, the midwife might resort to additional remedies, pressing warm cloths soaked in sage water to the girl's belly, burning protective herbs at the hearth, placing a charm in the doorway to prevent evil spirits from entering, a knife under the bed, blade turned away from the door to ward off harm. All of this, these rituals, these remedies, was meant not only to aid the body, but to calm the mind. In a time before analgesics, belief was often the only relief available. And after the child came, whether living or not, the rituals continued. Salt might be rubbed on the umbilical stump. A midwife might speak the Lord's Prayer while washing the newborn. A mother too weak to rise might be given a warming draught of ale, sweetened with honey and thyme. A candle left burning overnight to guide wandering spirits away from the child. These customs, layered with tenderness and superstition, reflect a world where science was yet unborn. But care, in its own way, flourished. Not perfect, not always enough, but full of meaning. And always, at the center, was the girl, carried along by the quiet strength of other women, protected in whatever ways they could manage. Not always safely, but always gently. In a world where power was often spoken in loud voices, from pulpits, from thrones, from written law, there also existed another kind of power, one passed not through proclamations, but through whispers, through the quiet murmurings of women seated beside hearths, or in candlelit rooms, or behind drawn curtains. This was the world of female knowledge, hidden, persistent, inherited. For the child bride, this knowledge was vital. It could mean the difference between enduring and perishing. And though it was never codified in books, it lived in memory, in instinct, and in the shared experiences of countless women across time. Much of this knowledge centered not on celebration, but on danger. There were warnings about pregnancies that came too soon, about labors that lasted too long, about the signs that something was going wrong. These warnings were not taught in schools or churches. They were passed through stories, through observation, through pain. Imagine a girl, no older than 13, sitting beside her aunt or older sister as they spin wool in the fading light. The elder woman begins to speak, not dramatically, but with care. "You must tell someone if the blood comes too early," she says. "You must rest when your back begins to ache. You must not carry the water pail after the 5th month." These are not instructions from physicians. They are lessons carved from lived experience, and within them lies truth, not always precise, but often correct in its way. The female body, they understood, gave signs. A darkening line down the belly, swollen feet, shortened breath, a change in appetite. They knew what it meant when a woman dreamed of fish. They understood cravings as more than superstition, as subtle cues from within. These ideas, to modern eyes, might seem quaint, but in a time when clinical knowledge was scarce, they were the map by which many navigated the most dangerous experience of their lives. There were also more difficult lessons. The midwives, the older matrons, had seen what happened when a birth went wrong. They had seen girls bleed, eyes wide with fear. They had seen babes born without sound. They had seen the aftermath, the grief that was not permitted to speak aloud. And so they whispered the signs. A brow that would not sweat, a labor that came too early or far too late, blood that did not stop, a baby that would not turn. They taught what to watch for, what to say, when to send for help, and when there was no help to send for. and they shared what to do when things could not be fixed. In some regions, women were taught to prepare a linen wrap and lay it in the sun, even before the birth began. For swaddling, they would say. But some knew it was not always for the living child. They prepared for both outcomes, joy and loss, not out of pessimism, but out of necessity. This knowledge also included the emotional, the language of grief, muted though it was. Older women understood that a girl who had lost her child might stop speaking, that she might sit for days staring at the fire, that she might need to be held, that she might forget how to eat. They had no names for postpartum depression, but they knew its shape. They called it sorrow, or the shadow, or the weight, and they knew, too, how to lift it, not with medicines, but with presence. A shared loaf of bread, a song, a visit from a neighbor with dried flowers, or a charm stitched into cloth. The act of weaving life back into a girl who had been forced to become a mother too soon. The knowledge they passed on was not always spoken clearly. Sometimes it was in the form of lullabies with double meanings, or stories about saints who died in childbirth, or warnings hidden in metaphors. Do not feed the fox too soon, or it will eat the henhouse. Cryptic, yes, but carefully constructed to bypass censure. This secrecy was necessary, because to question the traditions of child marriage, to suggest that a girl might not be ready, was to challenge the church, the family, the entire order of things. So women learned to speak in ways that could not be condemned. They taught their daughters what to expect, without ever saying it was wrong. They became stewards of survival, the only line of defense many child brides ever had. We find echoes of this in the few surviving women's texts from the time. Manuscripts passed quietly between hands, like the Trotula, a collection of medical advice written in the 12th century, attributed to a woman physician in Salerno. It includes remedies for difficult labor, advice for young mothers, and recognition of complications that male doctors ignored. And beyond the books, we find it in marginalia, scribbled notes in the margins of psalters and prayer books, where women wrote down herbal recipes and birthing instructions, hidden but preserved, a thread of knowledge running parallel to the official history. In these quiet teachings, we see not only survival, but resistance. A kind of resistance made not through rebellion, but through remembrance, through care, through the refusal to let another girl walk blind into the dark. We've spoken now of midwives and whispered warnings, of herbal stews and sacred charms. But we must also speak, gently, softly, of what came after, when the child did not cry, when the mother did not rise, when silence filled the spaces once meant for lullabies. This is the grief that came not with trumpets or procession, but with quiet, the private sorrow that followed the cradle, and led instead to the coffin. In the medieval world, grief had its rituals. Death was no stranger. It shaped the cadence of the seasons, winter bringing hunger, spring bringing plague, childbirth bringing risk at any time. For older adults, death was often marked with solemn ceremony, a priest, a tolling bell, the comfort of a proper burial. But when a child died, especially a newborn, especially one born to a child herself, those ceremonies were more uncertain. If the child had been baptized, even briefly, it would be wrapped, prayed over, and given a resting place within consecrated ground. A candle might be lit, a bell might toll once. The church would offer its blessings. But if the child had died before the priest arrived, if there was no baptism, the burial would be elsewhere. A quiet grave, sometimes beneath a tree, sometimes along a boundary wall, sometimes near the edge of the family's land, marked with a stone or not marked at all. And if the child had not yet drawn breath, born still and blue and silent, it might be called a miscarriage, a misfortune, an unblessed thing. It might be buried without a name, without a shroud, without anyone watching. For the mother, especially the very young mother, There was no formal space to grieve. She might be allowed to lie in bed for a few days. In noble households, she might be attended by a servant or visited by a priest. In peasant cottages, she might have only her mother beside her, dabbing her brow with a cloth, setting a bowl of broth at her side. But often, life pressed on. The child was gone. There were chores to return to, bread to bake, sheep to mend. In some households, even the signs of birth, blood-stained straw, soiled linens, were cleared away within the day, as if to erase the event. Imagine now the girl. A girl of 13, perhaps. Her belly still aching, her body hollow, her arms empty. She lies on her back, eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams above. Outside, the world continues. Carts creak past the lane. A rooster crows. The air carries the scent of peat smoke. Inside, the room is too quiet. She does not speak. Or if she does, it is in questions no one wants to answer. Why did it happen? Was it my fault? Will it come again? These are questions many medieval women must have asked, but few dared to speak them aloud, particularly young brides. Grief, for them, was a private thing, carried like a secret under the skin. There were small ways of remembering. A ribbon hidden in a chest, a cradle never used, tucked into the corner of a loft, a carved name whispered to the fire, and sometimes, rarely, a song. Lullabies were often sung after the baby was gone, not because the mother had lost her senses, but because there was no other space for mourning. The rhythm of the lullaby, slow and swaying, gave voice to what could not be said plainly. Songs that began with soothing words often turned into laments. Sleep now, my little one, sleep in the ground. The fields are your cradle, no crying, no sound. These songs were not shared with men. They were passed between women in kitchens and birthing rooms in the hush of twilight. A grief preserved in melody. Sometimes a midwife might return after the loss, sitting beside the girl with hands folded, not to heal, for that work was done, but simply to remain, to mark the space with presence, to remind her that she had been seen, that her sorrow, though unspoken, was real. Grief in this world had many shapes. Sometimes it was raw and loud, a mother weeping into her apron, but more often it was quiet, a blankness, a silence, a pause before returning to the rhythms of life. Some girls bore it silently for the rest of their lives. Others bore it again and again as more children came and more were lost. In the rare cases where they grew old, they might carry a necklace or token that no one else understood, a keepsake from the first child, the one who hadn't stayed. Even the church, with its rigid categories of blessed and unblessed, sometimes softened. Some priests quietly permitted burials for unbaptized infants. Some allowed prayers to be said. Not all, but some. Enough to remind us that compassion, like grief, persisted even when not recorded. And so the cradle, once prepared with such care, might be turned on its side, covered, forgotten, or remembered only by one, the girl who had carried life, lost it, and remained. There is no monument for these girls, no stone in the churchyard, no song in the history books. But we remember them here, in this quiet moment, in the gentle space between sleep and waking. History, like a tapestry, often weaves beauty over pain. As we turn now from the physical experience of child brides toward how their lives were represented, or more often, obscured, in art and chronicles, we begin to understand how memory is shaped. Carefully, selectively, we begin, fittingly, with queens. Royal child brides were not rare. They were celebrated, painted, chronicled, and written into legend, not for their youth or fragility, but for what they symbolized: alliances, virtue, fertility. Their bodies were vessels of diplomacy. Their wombs were the stage on which dynasties played out. Imagine a queen at 13, draped in silks too heavy for her small frame, crowned with gold, surrounded by older courtiers who bow and smile. She stands stiffly, learning quickly not to weep, not to show fear, not to speak unless addressed. Her name is recorded, her wedding celebrated, but her childhood erased. Take, for example, Isabella of Valois, who married Richard II of England at the age of 7. The marriage was not consummated, not immediately, but it was legally binding. She became a queen without understanding what it meant to be a woman. Painted in regal blues and surrounded by roses, her portraits show serenity. They do not show confusion or homesickness or the weight of expectation. Then there is Catherine de Valois, married to Henry V of England at age 18, older than most child brides, and yet her early years were shaped by preparations for marriage, groomed for alliance, for motherhood, for loss. These young royals were depicted in illuminated manuscripts, soft faces, serene gazes, holy gestures. Often they were likened to the Virgin Mary, the ultimate model of purity and submission. But the comparison was not a comfort. It was a trap. Mary, too, was depicted as young. In much of medieval art, she is no older than 12 or 13 when the angel appears. She is silent, accepting. Her purity is her power. And so, child brides were wrapped in her image, made holy by suffering, sanctified by sacrifice. Art reinforced these ideals. In tapestries and altarpieces, we see scenes of annunciation, of marriage, of motherhood. The girl depicted as radiant, passive, divine. The message was clear. A good bride does not resist. A holy woman bears the burden, quietly, with grace. This created a tension. The real experience of these girls, the blood, the fear, the pain, had no place in the imagery that surrounded them. What was celebrated was not their humanity, but their symbolism, their function. Even in court chronicles, where facts might have been more plainly stated, youth was often dismissed. She was of marriageable age, a chronicler might write of a girl barely into puberty. She fulfilled her duty. If she died, it was recorded with a line. If she lived, she bore children, disappeared into motherhood, or was married off again. One such example appears in the chronicle of a northern Italian court, where a girl of 12 is praised for her quiet grace during her marriage ceremony. No mention is made of her feelings, of her voice, only that the alliance was successful and the family prospered. These portrayals shaped how others understood child marriage. They softened it, sanctified it, made it appear beautiful, or at least inevitable. But outside the court and the canvas, the truth remained harder. Girls who were not royal still suffered. Their marriages were not painted. Their names were not recorded. They were not compared to Mary. They were not glorified. They were simply forgotten. There were exceptions. Occasional poets or letter writers who glimpsed the tragedy. A friar who notes, in a margin, the child wife died in pain. A merchant's account that laments the loss of a young daughter-in-law. But such voices were rare and fleeting. In stained glass windows, young brides are shown with halos. In reality, they may have died in silence. Let us not be fooled by gold leaf and holy light. These girls were not saints. They were children. And to wrap them in the language of sainthood is to erase the struggle they endured. As you lie quietly now, listening, perhaps with eyes closed or half dreaming, imagine one of those paintings, the girl with the soft expression, seated beside her husband, hands folded in her lap. Now imagine what lies beneath the paint, the tension in her spine, the ache in her belly, the thoughts she cannot say aloud. Art in the medieval world was not meant to reflect the world as it was, but as it should be. It was didactic, devotional, and idealized, not documentary. And so, much of the sorrow we have spoken of was not painted, not carved, not preserved in pigment or panel. But if you look closely, very closely, you can sometimes catch a glimmer of what was left unsaid. Let us begin with the Psalter, the prayer book. These small volumes, often created by hand and illuminated in cloisters or courtly scriptoria, were among the most personal objects of the medieval elite, passed between mothers and daughters, given as wedding gifts, carried in childbirth, and buried with their owners. Within their pages, amidst the Latin psalms and gilded letters, we find marginalia, small drawings and images at the edge of the page, often playful, sometimes crude, but occasionally haunting. A girl kneeling in prayer, her hands folded beneath a crown of thorns, a cradle overturned, a woman with eyes closed, lying beside a tiny coffin. These images were not explained. They did not interrupt the holy text, but they linger, quiet witnesses to the grief and hardship that language could not hold. In one French psalter from the 14th century, an image appears of the flight into Egypt, Mary on a donkey, Joseph leading. But in the corner, barely noticeable, a small girl clutches her belly, doubled over. The donkey's eye looks back at her. The scribe left no caption. Only the image remains. Art historians debate whether such details were symbolic or simply decorative. But for those who have studied them carefully, a pattern emerges. The margins of these books often held private truths. The center was for saints and salvation. The edges, for sorrow. In larger works, tapestries, panels, altarpieces, the child bride was more difficult to locate. She might appear as the Virgin Mary, as we discussed, or as a generic holy woman, blonde, pale, serene. But the iconography hid as much as it revealed. In one panel from a cathedral in Bohemia, a scene of the marriage of the Virgin is rendered in exquisite detail. Joseph is old, bearded. Mary is impossibly youthful, her figure narrow, her face round with childhood. She looks downward, not with humility, as tradition claims, but with something else. Hesitation, perhaps, or resignation. Elsewhere, in a book of hours owned by a noblewoman in Flanders, we find a page dedicated to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth. She is shown emerging from a dragon, whole and radiant. But around her, drawn faintly in ink, are scenes of labor. A woman clutching a stool, another with her head in her hands. Pain rendered gently, but unmistakably. These fragments offer more than piety. They offer quiet empathy, perhaps even remembrance. Not all visual references were sympathetic, however. Some art echoed the cultural expectation that women, even girls, were meant to suffer. In representations of Eve, pain is shown as the price of sin. In images of childbirth, midwives stand calm, but the mothers grimace. In woodcuts illustrating moral tales, a young wife is sometimes punished for resisting her role. A cautionary figure, not a heroine. And yet, even within these frames, humanity slips through. A portrait from the early 15th century shows a girl in a veil, her gaze not toward her husband, but out of frame, away from the ceremony unfolding. Her expression is not joy, nor submission. It is distance. The artist may not have meant to capture sorrow, but it is there. In church carvings, misericords, and choir stalls, we sometimes find small depictions of women in labor, bent low, held by others, faces strained. These details are carved into places that were hidden when not in use, visible only when the seat was raised. A hidden pain in a hidden place. It is there, too, in the embroidery of altar cloths, in the pattern stitched by hand, not always part of the design. A small tear, a drop of red thread, a figure curled in sleep. We cannot be sure of the intent, but we can feel its weight. These images, dispersed and subtle, form a kind of visual whisper, a reminder that art, even when bound by convention, could not fully erase the lived truth of girls who became brides and mothers and mourners far too young. And still, Many are missing. The girl who died before her wedding day, the one who lost her child but never spoke of it again, the ones who never had portraits, never held a psalter, never entered a church whose floors they scrubbed. They appear only in our imagination now. But imagination, like memory, can be an act of restoration. So as you rest here, perhaps with your eyes closed, picture a page in a medieval book, gilded, illustrated, a border of vines. In one corner, a girl with her hand on her belly, eyes closed. Not suffering, not weeping, just there, seen. If you were to open the dusty pages of a medieval chronicle, you might expect to find stories of kings and crusades, of oaths and excommunications, of treaties inked by trembling hands, and battles fought on damp fields. And you would. But you would also find, scattered here and there, the quiet appearances of girls, young brides, barely described, often unnamed. Chronicles, particularly those kept in courts and monasteries, were the official memories of the medieval world. They were not diaries, nor works of empathy. They recorded what was considered important: inheritances, political marriages, deaths of note, coronations. And so, when a noble girl was wed at 12 or 13, her story appeared not as her own, but as an extension of her family's fortunes. Imagine the entry: on the feast of St. Hilary, Lord Geoffrey did take to wife the Lady Eveline, daughter of Sir Edmund of Monmouth, aged 13 winters. The dowry was of lands in Pembroke and 5 marks of silver. No more. No mention of Eveline's feelings, of her health, of her fears. Her name is there, yes, but only to mark the transfer of property, of bloodline, of alliance. And yet, read enough of these entries, and patterns emerge. You begin to see the shape of a world where girlhood had no time to grow, where marriage was arranged before teeth had fallen, where girls became wives between festivals and harvests. In one chronicle of a southern German duchy, 3 daughters are listed, all married before 14. One died within a year of a fever brought on by childbirth. The others disappear from the record, reappearing only as the mothers of sons, their names swallowed by their husbands' titles. Occasionally, the chronicler lingers, not often, but just enough to catch her breath. One monk, writing in the margins of a monastic record, notes the sadness of a marriage made in too much haste, and describes the bride, pale and silent, who was led as if to a shrine. It is a rare moment of reflection, buried beneath lists of abbey repairs and papal disputes. We sometimes find more intimate glimpses in letters, especially among the merchant class, where record-keeping was practical. A father writes to his cousin, "My daughter Agnes is now betrothed. She is small but strong. May God see her safely through the coming months." Another laments, "The girl is gone. She bled too long." The midwife says the child was not rightly turned. Such letters were not written for public record. They were personal, fragile, but they show what the official chronicles often avoided: the fragility of life and the humanness of grief. Among the nobility, marriage negotiations were often described in great detail. Contracts survived, signed by witnesses and sealed with wax. And from these, we can infer the girl's value: her dowry, her lands, her obligations. But her voice? Her thoughts? Nowhere to be found. Take the case of Eleanor of Brittany, engaged before her 12th birthday. Her marriage was planned as part of a delicate balance between kingdoms. She was moved, escorted, presented. Her bridal journey chronicled like the movements of a ship. And when the marriage failed, she was confined, her name continuing in documents, but her story stopped. Sometimes, the girl is mentioned only after death. Lady Cecily, aged 14, passed from this world in her lying in. The babe was still. A light was burned in the chapel for 7 nights. And that is all. The chronicle moves on. To coinage, to floods, to a bishop's appointment. The truth is that these girls lived in a world where memory was formal, And femininity, especially youthful femininity, was rarely granted a full voice. They were remembered not as people, but as roles: the bride, the mother, the alliance, the vessel. And yet their presence remains, a shimmer in the ink, a question in the silence. When a chronicler writes, "She was pleasing and obedient," we wonder, what lies behind those words? Was she afraid? Did she cry? Did anyone hear? In a few rare cases, girls wrote back. Some noble daughters, taught to read and write, left behind fragments, prayers, notes, margins filled with symbols. One wrote, "Pray for me. I am with child and only just begun." Another copied a psalm and added her own line at the bottom. "Let this cup pass from me." We don't know their names, but their voices reach us, faint but enduring. We come now to the faintest traces, to the places in history where names vanish, where lives go unrecorded, where the ink itself fades into silence. Not every child bride was a princess or a noble daughter. Most were not. Most were the children of farmers, laborers, artisans, and smallholders. They did not marry for treaty or title, but because of debt, convenience, or necessity. And so, they are the ones we lose first, not to time, but to forgetting. The official documents, court rolls, marriage registers, annals, rarely mention them. And if they do, it is brief, and almost always without age. A line such as, "John the Weaver wed Alice, daughter of Thomas." Witnesses, William the baker, Marjorie the midwife. It may be all we know, and even that tells us only that it occurred, nothing more. But in the quiet corners of monastic books, the margins, the flyleaves, the pages reused or repurposed, we sometimes find something different. A scribble, a note, a name unconnected to any grand event. In one Benedictine manuscript from the late 13th century, between sermons and scripture, someone, likely a monk, wrote, "She did not survive the night. Her mother weeps." No name is given, no age. But the context suggests childbirth, and the sorrow feels immediate. These marginalia were not part of the official record. They were private, personal. Perhaps the monk knew her. Perhaps she was brought to the abbey gates in desperation. Perhaps the entry was simply a quiet moment of compassion, recorded for no audience but himself. Elsewhere, in the binding of a reused parchment, a list of debts appears. Among them, for cloth to wrap the small one, for herbs for Ellen, for prayers said for the soul of the girl. This girl, unnamed, is remembered only through transactions of mourning. In a Cistercian ledger from northern England, a page includes a short, nearly invisible line, written between entries about livestock and grain, the young wife of Matthew, gone too soon. And then the next line resumes, 2 new calves born in Lent. Life continued, but the grief, that brief interruption, remains. In some cases, the forgotten left physical traces. A shallow grave found near the edge of a churchyard wall, too small for an adult, too large for an infant. No marker, no name, just bones. Scholars suggest it may have been a young girl, perhaps buried in haste, or without formal blessing. Perhaps a child bride who died in labor. Perhaps not. We will never know. But she is part of this story, because for every Margaret Beaufort or Isabella of Valois, there were hundreds, thousands, whose lives followed the same pattern. Married young, pregnant early, ended soon. They left no letters, no portraits, only the space they once filled. Occasionally, a midwife or village priest tried to preserve something more. A note in the back of a parish register. The girl called Sis, so small. The child did not live. She bled into the straw. May the Lord take her gently. Again, no surname, no age, no one left to remember her, except perhaps the one who wrote those words. And in rare cases, Even that memory fades. Pages torn, ink washed out, books lost to fire or rot. The silence grows. But still, we look, because history is not only made of what is recorded, it is made, too, of what is absent, of the spaces where a name should be, of the bed left empty, of the cradle turned to face the wall. And so we remember them not through monuments, but through witness, through the act of pausing, of listening to silence as though it were a voice. Imagine, if you will, a cloister at dusk. The stones are cool beneath your feet. A soft wind stirs the ivy. Somewhere nearby, a monk is copying a psalm by lamplight. He pauses. In the margin, he writes only this: "Pray for the girl. She was brave." That is all. We arrive now at the threshold between memory and movement, between the stillness of the past and the slow turn of change. In this final segment, we will begin by examining the laws that shape the lives of child brides. Not the customs or rituals, but the formal structures that permitted, encouraged, and sustained such practices. Laws drawn in ink and bound by authority, often cloaked in piety, often beyond challenge. In the medieval world, the idea of consent was different. Consent was not understood as emotional readiness or informed choice. It was, more often, a matter of capacity, the capacity to utter a formula, to understand one's obligation, to satisfy the church that a marriage had been entered into freely, even if freedom was never truly present. Canon law, the body of church law that governed much of Europe, recognized 12 as the minimum age for marriage for girls and 14 for boys. These numbers were not rooted in medicine or psychology, but in tradition and theological precedent. They marked the assumed age of physical maturity, of being able to reproduce and therefore to wed. But these were minimums, not guidelines, not ideals. In practice, many girls were betrothed younger, 5, 6, sometimes even in infancy. These early unions were not typically consummated, but they were binding in spirit, contracts sealed with a handshake or a kiss, confirmed by family, and often witnessed by clergy. And if a girl reached 12, her marriage could legally proceed. She could be taken to her husband's home. She could be bedded. She could become a mother before her 13th birthday. Some church voices, even in those times, urged caution. Canonists and bishops sometimes wrote that marriage should be delayed until maturity. But their words were just that, advice, not rule. Enforcement was rare. Culture prevailed. Families made decisions. Priests blessed them. And girls, young and silent, complied. The idea of childhood as a protected phase of life had not yet taken shape. There were no juvenile courts, no systems of guardianship beyond the family. The family, and particularly the father, had legal and moral authority. A girl was considered his to give, and then her husband's to keep. In parts of medieval Europe, laws were more explicit. In some Germanic regions, local custom allowed marriage contracts to be binding upon betrothal, with no recourse for the child to object, even once she reached a higher age. In southern France, dowry laws allowed families to offer girls in marriage in exchange for even modest landholdings, with church support. In England, legal disputes over land often invoked marriage contracts made between children, settled by court based on whether the correct oaths had been spoken, not on whether either party understood them. Rape laws, too, were different. Marital rape, as a concept, did not exist. A husband had legal and moral dominion over his wife. If she was 12 or 13 or younger, and the marriage had been consummated with church blessing, there was no recourse, no crime. The law did not recognize her protest, only the contract. It is important to remember that these laws were not considered cruel by most of their makers. They reflected a society in which lineage, property, obedience, and sacrifice were the dominant values. Love, as we now think of it, was rare in marriage. Choice, even rarer. The consequences of these laws were profound. They shaped lives before they began. They transformed childhood into duty. And they rendered girls legally and physically vulnerable at the very moment they were most in need of protection. But over time, the laws began to change. Very slowly, very unevenly, often reluctantly. By the early modern period, legal age minimums were being re-examined in some regions. Enlightenment thinkers questioned consent. Medical knowledge began to recognize the dangers of early pregnancy. Protestant reformers, in particular, emphasized marital consent as a mutual decision, though even they rarely questioned child marriage outright. In England, by the 18th century, the age of consent for marriage without parental approval was raised to 21, but only in civil terms. The Church continued to recognize marriages at 12 and 14 for centuries longer. It was not until the 19th and early 20th centuries that most Western nations began formally outlawing child marriage. And even then, exceptions remained. Parental consent could override age limits. Exceptions were made for culture, for religion, for special circumstances. To this day, in some countries, these exceptions persist. And so, the footsteps of those child brides, faint though they may be, echo into the present, not only in laws, but in patterns, in beliefs, in silence. But there is hope in knowing that laws like stories can be rewritten, that what was once seen as normal can be revealed for what it was, that remembrance can shape reform. Imagine now a courtroom in some distant century. A judge presides, a clerk scribbles, and a father stands to defend the early marriage of his daughter. He speaks of duty, of tradition, of honor. But in a corner of the gallery sits a young girl, barely 10, her hands clasped, her eyes cast down. And somewhere, perhaps in a later century, perhaps in our own, someone reads that record and says, this was not right. That act of seeing, of naming, of questioning, is the beginning of change. Amidst the many stories of early loss, there were also survivors. Girls who married before their voices had deepened, who carried pregnancies in bodies not yet grown, who passed through pain, through silence, and somehow lived, not untouched, not unchanged, but alive. Their lives rarely drew notice. The chronicles do not linger on them. The records record them only as wives, as mothers, as parts of households and families. But beneath those titles, there were women who endured, and who sometimes found ways to shape a second life. Let us begin with a common scenario: the girl widowed young. In the medieval world, child brides often married older men, men established enough to offer a dowry match or in need of an heir. These men were often in their 30s, 40s, even older. Many did not live long. And so, a girl married at 12 or 13 could find herself a widow by 15 or 16. With widowhood came something unusual: agency. A widow, particularly one with children or land, had more legal standing than a maiden or wife. She could administer property, appear in court, manage a household. She might not be entirely free. Her in-laws might interfere. Her late husband's will might restrict her. But she had more space in which to breathe, to exist, and some used that space well. In one set of English manor rolls from the 14th century, we find reference to a woman called Marjorie of Sudborne. She married at 13, was widowed at 16, and went on to manage a small farm on her own. The scribe notes, almost with surprise, that she conducted herself capably. She is mentioned again years later, leasing land and raising 3 children. She left no letters, no image. But in those dry legal entries, a second life unfolds. Not grand, but steady. Her survival not only physical, but social. Other girls, too, found unexpected paths. Some remarried, often not by choice. but with more voice than before. A widow had, in theory, the right to approve or refuse a second husband. Many did not refuse. Some did. Those who did not remarry might enter religious life. A convent offered refuge, not always from the world, but from men, from childbirth, from the household roles that had marked their early lives. In the records of a convent near Bruges, there is mention of a Sister Clara, received into the order at 16, widowed, and childless. The abbess notes her fragile disposition and quiet demeanor, but also that she sings clearly and copies scripture with care. It's possible that for Clara, like many, the convent was not a prison, but a breath of relief. Others survived within the household roles they had been given. They became mothers and mothers again. They grew into their duties. They found solace in routine, in the seasonal rhythms of harvest and hearth. Some found kindness in their husbands. Others quiet pride in their children. Their days passed without drama, but not without depth. And sometimes they became the wise women, the ones who had seen too much, too young, and who carried that knowledge into midwifery, into storytelling, into the quiet mentoring of the next generation. We find one such example in a letter from a 15th century midwife to her daughter, preserved in the collection of a cathedral school. She writes, "You must sit with the girl who does not speak. You must watch her breathing. Do not ask her to smile. Let her grieve." It is not a letter of triumph, but of understanding, of care passed on. These survivors were not loud. Their lives were not filled with protest or rebellion. They lived within the systems that shaped them, but they lived. And survival, in a world that often expected them to vanish, was itself a quiet form of resistance. Imagine one of them now, an older woman in her 50s perhaps, her hair streaked with gray, her fingers calloused from work, sitting at the edge of a village green, watching children play. One of them runs past her, barefoot and laughing, as she smiles, though faintly. She remembers, perhaps, the day she was sent away, the wedding veil too large, the weight of expectation too heavy, the pain that came too early. But she also remembers the dawn after, the breath she still had, the bread she baked, the child who lived. Her life may not have been free, but it was long, and that, in her world, was a kind of victory. Even the deepest traditions can, over time, be re-examined. What once felt as fixed as the stone walls of a monastery may, with the passage of generations, begin to show cracks. And so it was, slowly, unevenly, with child marriage. The shift did not come all at once. There was no declaration that childhood would now be honored, that young girls would be spared the burden of marriage and motherhood. Instead, there were murmurs, arguments, reforms folded into other reforms, an awakening that occurred not in a single moment, but across centuries. In the Enlightenment, thinkers began to reconsider the very idea of personhood. Childhood was increasingly seen as distinct, not merely a phase to be survived, but a protected time of formation. Philosophers such as John Locke argued that children were not miniature adults, but creatures of potential and delicacy, deserving of nurture, education, and time. Legal reforms followed, but hesitantly. In England, the Marriage Act of 1753, sometimes called Lord Hardwicke's Act, imposed stricter conditions on marriage, requiring parental consent for those under 21. It did not prohibit child marriage outright, but it established the idea that such unions should be carefully supervised. Across Europe, similar reforms appeared, though they varied widely in enforcement. The Church, once a pillar of the system, began to revise its teachings. No longer was the minimum age of 12 accepted without question. Pastoral concern began to take precedence over tradition. In some dioceses, priests were instructed not to officiate marriages of those under a certain age, even if legally permitted. By the 19th century, a new force had joined the conversation: medicine. Doctors, many newly empowered by the rise of scientific thinking, began to document the physical consequences of early childbirth. Reports described obstructed labor in teenage girls, chronic injuries, death. These were not new phenomena, but they were now named, measured, made visible. And so the conversation shifted again, from theology to physiology, from what was permissible to what was dangerous. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, movements for women's rights and child protection gathered strength. Activists pointed to the age-old practice of child marriage as a form of sanctioned abuse. Some succeeded in pushing through age of consent laws. Others raised awareness, connecting early marriage to broader issues of education, poverty, and gender inequality. Yet even as laws changed, myths endured. One enduring myth is that child marriage was always romanticized, as though medieval girls dreamed of wedding gowns and dashing knights. In truth, most had no say. They did not write love letters. They did not choose. They were told. Another misconception is that child marriage was rare, an anomaly of royalty or foreign lands. In fact, it was widespread across class and geography. Noble girls were the exception, only in that their lives were documented. The rest lived and died in silence. And even today, the myth persists that such practices belong to the distant past. But in truth, child marriage still exists. Around the world, in many cultures, girls are married before 18. In some countries, laws permit it under special circumstances. In others, enforcement is lax. Even in the United States, several states allow minors to marry with parental or judicial approval. The echoes of the past are not so distant after all. What, then, has changed? Much, though not everything. The modern world recognizes childhood as a protected phase. Most international laws define 18 as the minimum age for marriage. Organizations advocate, educate, intervene. Survivors speak out. Awareness has grown, but culture shifts slowly. Just as in the medieval world, families today may see marriage as a path to security, to honor, to tradition. Poverty, displacement, and inequality still drive the practice. The justifications may have new words, but the pattern remains, and so remembrance matters. By looking back carefully, compassionately, we expose the roots of a practice that continues. We resist the temptation to romanticize, to sanitize, or to dismiss. We give voice to the lives hidden behind phrases like married young or passed in childbed. Imagine a classroom today where students read about a queen married at 12. A hand is raised, a question asked. Was that normal? The teacher pauses. And if they answer honestly, if they speak of bloodlines and politics, of fear and pain, of the girls we've followed on this quiet journey, then something changes. A memory becomes a lesson, and a lesson becomes a reason, and a reason becomes a call. Now we arrive, slowly, at the end of this path. We've walked through centuries of quiet sorrow, through lives folded into history's edges, through the hush of birthing rooms and the stillness of forgotten graves. And as we stand in this final moment, just before the present, it's worth pausing, not to judge, but to reflect. The world of child brides in the medieval age was not a world of villains and victims, not in the simple sense. It was a world shaped by necessity, belief, and inherited rhythm. People did what they believed was right, or at least what was expected. They acted within systems much older than themselves. And yet, girls suffered. Children were asked to bear what they should not have had to. They were praised for their obedience, their purity, their silence. Their deaths were sometimes mourned, sometimes ignored, often accepted. But they were never truly forgotten. Not completely. Because even in the sparsest record, even in the single line, she died in childbed, something lingers. A life, a voice, a small thread of being. As we reflect now, we see the contrast between them. And now, you listening to this, perhaps wrapped in a soft blanket, your head resting on a pillow, surrounded by gentle modern comforts, are part of a world that has changed in profound ways. A world where childhood is, more often than not, protected. Where girls can learn to read before they are asked to serve. Where laws are written to prevent what was once common. And still, the echoes remain. In customs that persist. In laws not yet fully reformed. In silence that endures around topics too uncomfortable to speak aloud. But perhaps you've noticed, silence does not mean absence. The story of child brides is not only one of pain. It is also one of endurance. Of the women who survived. Of the midwives who tried. Of the scribes who paused to record a name. Of the mothers who sang lullabies to children that never opened their eyes. Of the girls who grew old enough to tell others what they had seen. It is a story of small resistances. A girl who ran from her betrothal. A woman who did not remarry. A sister who stayed beside the bed and whispered a prayer no one else dared speak. It is, in the end, a story of memory. And you are part of that memory now. By listening, by imagining, by allowing yourself to drift into the cadence of lives so distant and yet not so different. Imagine, if you will, a field just beyond a medieval village. The wind moves through the tall grasses. The sky is the color of soft slate. A single grave lies there, unmarked. But nearby, someone has left a posy of herbs, rue, rosemary, lavender. Perhaps someone remembered. Perhaps you just did. And so now, we reach the end of this long, slow journey. You've walked through the corridors of time, past heavy oak doors and low-burning hearths, along narrow roads and through rooms where candles flickered and voices hushed. You've heard stories not shouted, but whispered. You've followed the threads of lives lived quietly, often briefly, sometimes barely noticed. And now, there is nothing more to do. Let the stories fade. Let the names drift like smoke on evening air. Let the rhythm of your breath return to stillness. There is comfort in knowing the past, not to dwell, but to see more clearly, to understand how far we've come, and to listen for the soft voices that remain. If sleep has not come yet, let it come gently now. There's no need to stay awake. The candles are low. The halls are quiet. The story is over, but the quiet continues. Thank you for being here, in this peaceful corner of time. And if you haven't already, you are warmly invited to subscribe to this gentle little channel. Leave us a soft word in the comments. If you wish, tell us where you're listening from, or what time of day it found you. It means more than you know. Until next time, rest well.